Hello and welcome to Piece of Pod, a podcast brought to you by South Coast law firm Warner Goodman. I'm Sarah Whitemore. I'm an employment lawyer and senior partner in the firm with over 30 years of experience. In this podcast, I'll be having conversations with law firm partners, business owners, clients and other contacts of mine, and we'll be engaging in conversations about running businesses, career journeys, and how to excel in the world of work. So if that's of interest, why not grab yourself a cuppa, get yourself comfortable, and let's dive in. My guest today is one of the lucky ones because he's a retired law firm partner. Andrew Chalkley. It's Andrew who I met in China, or probably in Reading before we went to China. He's one of my China Chums. And I've spoken with a number of my China Chums on the podcast so far, so it'll be interesting to hear Andrew's take on China. At the time, he was managing partner of a law firm, Boyes Turner, in Reading.
In China, I'd gone to Reading.
But previous to that, he had been a leading lawyer and indeed partner and managing partner of Southampton law firms, Hepburn, Winstanley and Pugh, as was, and Bond Pearce, I think.
I was managing partner there. Sorry.
There you go. We'll get it correct by the end of the podcast. He's a pilot.
I am.
He's one of the three amigos, and we've had two of the amigos so far. So I'm excited to explore the third of the three. And of course, we've got an opportunity to explore all that on this podcast. So, well, just correct me to start with. Where were you partners and
how did it work? So I went to Hepburn, Winstanley and Pugh in 1977 as a trainee solicitor, or article clerk as we were then called. Did 4 years articles. I'd been to the College of Law, done my part ones. Qualified in 1982. Became a partner at Hepburn, Winstanley and Pugh in 1983 at the age of 24, which was
very quick.
In those days it was possible. These days I doubt it is. And by the age of 29, I was managing partner of Hepburn, Winstanley and Pugh. Was managing partner there for 10 years. We then merged the firm with what was then Bond Pearce. Went on to become what is now
Bond Dickinson.
Bond Dickinson, a global firm, I think it is now. And I was there for 2 years. My role, I was a partner there, but my role was director of resources because I was a slightly awkward fit in that merger, in that I'd been a full-time managing partner of Hepburn and therefore not doing very much legal work. So I had to do something at Bond Pearce, and there was quite a lot of work to do in terms of making the merger work and gluing it all together. So that was really my role there. I have to say, before the merger and after the merger, I did wonder in my own mind whether being part of a huge law firm like that was really me. I mean, I think my sweet spot, if you like, is being part of a small to medium-sized regional firm and making a difference in that sort of firm. So after 2 years, I began to think, well, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? There was an opportunity at that stage to possibly go off and do some flying. That came to a grinding halt when I went for my CAA medical to get a Class 1 medical, which they thought, this bloke can't really see. I'm not sure he should be flying commercial aeroplanes.
Health and safety. That.
So I then saw an advertisement in a newspaper of a firm in Reading looking to appoint their first chief executive, and I did some research on the firm, and it looked very much like Hepburn had looked 5, 6, 7 years prior to that, and I just thought, well, there's an opportunity to pick up the reins and carry on doing what I was doing. Reading is a fascinating place, and I've always been interested in Reading. It's very much, part of the UK Silicon Valley, on that M4 corridor, lots of really big businesses. And I thought there's a real opportunity there. So I joined that firm just after my 40th birthday, actually, and was chief executive there for 20 years. Stepped down in my last year as part of the retirement plan. I planned to retire 2 years before I did. Formulated a sort of plan to find some succession. And for the last year, I did your job, senior partner. And that was interesting because no sooner did I start that we went into lockdown because of COVID, and I found myself working at home, which was a big rehearsal for retirement, really.
Absolutely, yeah.
But interestingly, also a very challenging time, and a lot of what I was doing in that period was helping people cope with that huge transition that we all made, and also looking forward to what would happen when it all came to the end, and would there be a big return to work, or would we go into some sort of hybrid working? And so I sort of left the legal profession in stages, really.
Right, and at a point when things had radically changed from when you started.
Very different, and very strange times.
So lots to unpick there,
Yeah.
Andrew. For the benefit of the audience who perhaps aren't as old as you and I, and maybe don't know about Hepburn Winstanley and Pugh, it's a firm that I was very familiar with when I was an article clerk. I think I was one of the last article clerks, or I might have been one of the first trainee solicitors 30 odd years ago. Yeah. But what sort of size was Hepburn? So in terms of partners
when I joined Hepburn, it was quite small. It grew, but it was still quite a small firm when we left. I think there were about 11 partners. We were turning over, I think when we merged, about £4 million. It was one of the oldest law firms in the country. We actually traced our history back to 1646, I think it was. It was founded by a gentleman called Joseph Christmas, who was a merchantman in Southampton and quite involved in the sort of local politics. And in those days, it seemed that the merchantmen also were the lawyers. And we traced the firm's history right from those days. It grew quite substantially in the 80s and 90s on the back of a particular client who I'm sure we will talk about.
We will.
And they were very interesting times. Yeah. And I took over the helm, as I say, as managing partner, the first managing partner the firm had round about, I guess, 88. And that was a pretty busy 10 to 12 years of growth for the firm.
So I did my training contract in 1992, so slightly later than that, but around that sort of time, I think Ian Curtis had been appointed as the first managing partner at Warner Goodman. So what happened in law firms before we had managing partners? Because all of my career, we've had them.
Well, it's interesting. I think, when I first went into Hepburns, I think Hepburns was a pretty traditional firm. All the partners did all the administration, all the decisions were made in partners' meetings, and you had a partners' meeting every month. All the partners turned up. They all had sort of nominal roles. One was in charge of people and one was in charge of, marketing. And I
remember our IT partner saying, I put my head up at one point and they said, has anyone got a laptop? And I said, yes. And he said, I was then told, well, you're the IT partner. But this also was in the 90s.
We were in a very different era then. We did not have IT, really.
No.
I mean, the way we communicated was a telex machine or the telephone. The telephone system occupied, the telephone machine occupied an entire room. It was huge. We certainly didn't have email or anything like that. So it was a very different era. And, you used to go to those partners meetings and the senior partner would sort of read the minutes from the previous meetings where various people had agreed to do various things. And then he'd go around the room and say, well, how are we getting on with that? And, to a man, we all said, well, we've been so busy.
Yeah, I've been doing client work.
Yeah, we haven't had a chance to do any of that. And that's how it was. And some things got done, quite a lot of things didn't get done. And there's sort of evolved then the concept of appointing a practice manager. And these poor souls were brought into law firms. Quite a lot of them actually were ex-military, which was ridiculous, really, because they're used to, lines of authority, chains of command, organisation, and a degree of, everybody knows what everybody should be doing. Suddenly they're thrust amongst a load of partners who all think they're in charge, all doing their own thing in their own way, and they, bless them, were not given really any authority to do anything, but were expected to make it all work. And it didn't really work very well. I mean, there were some that were very good at it, and quite a lot who weren't. And then eventually, I think law firms suddenly realised actually they needed to start running themselves properly as businesses, and the partners needed to cede a degree of authority to somebody to not only run the machine and make sure it worked efficiently, but actually to have some vision about where it was all going. I mean, it was becoming a far more competitive market, and firms were beginning to consolidate. And you really had to start thinking about, well, what are we going to do? Where are we going to put ourselves in this market? And so people took on those roles. Most of us, I include myself in this, had very little, if no, training to do it.
Well, I was going to ask about that because we often deal with businesses where the best mechanic has been promoted to be the garage manager, but it's not necessarily got the skills, the people skills, the leadership skills, or the somebody working in a gym has suddenly owns the gym, but he doesn't really know how to run the business. And are we in danger of being much the same within the legal profession?
I think we've been very guilty of that, and certainly, how many days have I woken up thinking, I've got to solve this problem and I've got no idea how to do it, and you muddle through. But there was also a growing industry at the time of the larger firms had managing partners for a long time, and some of those had stepped down and were setting up consultancies. And I latched on to somebody called David Andrews at the time, who was running residential courses for prospective managing partners. And David was really good. I mean, he broke it down into marketing, into finance, into strategy, into how to manage people or whatever, and really gave those of us who went on his courses a really good grounding of the basics. So at least you had a toolkit to work with. And as time went by, you started bringing in other professionals to support you. So we didn't have IT, so we didn't have IT people. HR was not something that you brought in professionals to do. Marketing was, going out with your mates and having a beer and
well, we hadn't long since been allowed to advertise, really, had we? It's relatively new.
But as this developed, these people sort of appeared on the horizon, and you could bring in an HR manager, or perhaps you'd had a practice manager who actually had shown some flair in, trying to keep the secretaries happy, and so you promoted them to your HR manager. And then, suddenly we had PCs on our desk, and nobody knew how to work them, and lawyers frequently broke them, and so you needed somebody who was savvy in IT. So you got a technical person in. And it just developed. And
I think all of this will ring true with a lot of our audience who are just business owners, not necessarily lawyers. Some lawyers, of course, but a lot of business owners, because they've got the same experience too. They, over the last 30 years, have seen, well, first of all, a growth in employment law. We probably didn't need HR managers in 1992 when I started in the profession, because we had very little employment law.
Well, when I started in the profession, we didn't really have dedicated employment lawyers.
No.
I mean, my litigation partner at the time in Hepburn, Tony Ascombe, was basically a litigator. He did county court and high court litigation, and he did a bit of employment law. And employment law, as you say, mushroomed, and then suddenly we needed the specialism. I think Europe had a lot to do with that, didn't it?
Probably, and the case that we're going to talk about as well. But before we go much further in terms of your career, let's just go back a bit to the beginning of it. What brought you into the law in the first place?
Well, there's a family history. My brother was a solicitor. My father was a solicitor in Andover, but by the time I'd come into the law, he had given up legal practice and become what was then known as a county court and high court district registrar, now known as a district judge. And he was in fact the county court district registrar in Southampton, and that caused some interesting issues when I was actually a trainee going to county court appointments and suddenly ended up appearing before my father, which was always an interesting experience.
Do you feel he gave you a harder time because of that, or the opposite maybe?
No, I don't think he did that. I think he was eminently fair with everybody. I mean, he used to, rigorously explain to people who didn't know me that, there was this relationship, and if they really were worried about it, he wouldn't hear the case. But most of the local solicitors knew him and knew me, and so it all worked very well. No, he wasn't. He was very much a mentor to me. I mean, he really did sort of persuade me that law might be a career that I should be interested in. When I was at school, my A-levels were actually science A-levels. So I did chemistry, physics and biology at A-level and a maths for science course or something. And actually I was looking at going into medicine. And I actually got an offer from Charing Cross Medical School to do medicine. But I wasn't sure. Father was a bit of an inspiration for me. Other people, I became a bit fixated on Lord Denning at the time. He just seemed to me a fascinating character, and some of the cases that I read, that he'd been involved with, he was changing law, and that sort of caught my imagination.
Did you ever meet him?
I met him twice. I also, when I qualified, my father knew him. My father, he lived at Whitchurch, and my father obviously lived in Andover. And father had done some work with him when he was a solicitor in Andover, and so had got to know him a bit. I wouldn't say they were close friends, but they knew each other. And when I qualified, he wrote to Lord Denning and said, "My son Andrew's qualifying as a solicitor, and I'd like to give him something to just sort of mark that occasion, because I'm a solicitor and I've been very proud to see him doing that. Would you mind signing one of your books for him?" And he wrote back a really lovely letter, sort of, "Yes, I remember you, and we did this and this, and really nice to hear about your son Andrew. So please drop the book in and I'll sign it." And I have got at home this book, and he's written a little message in the front, addressed to me personally and wishing me well in my career. I met him twice. He used to come to the legal service at Winchester Cathedral every year. They had a big sort of gathering, and all the judges used to process into the. So my father was part of that. By then he was a circuit judge, so my father was part of that. And afterwards, you go up to the courts in Winchester, and there would be refreshment, and Lord Denning would circulate. And remarkable, really, a very nice man, engaging, interested in people, interested in what you're doing. So I met him there once, and he also came and spoke at a Hampshire Incorporated Law Society dinner once, and again circulated, and we had a chat then. So yes.
And he's responsible for the man on the Clapham omnibus, I think, isn't he?
He is, and lots of other things, equitable estoppel, and quite a lot of. There is this. I think my father gave him a lift once to a dinner. He picked him up from his house in Whitchurch and gave him a lift, and he got in the car, and father sort of trying to show him how to put the seatbelt on. These are the days where you didn't have to wear a seatbelt.
With no clunk click at that stage.
And Lord Denning said, "Oh, don't worry about that, it'll be fine." And father said, "Well, I think you gave the judgment where you said contributory negligence, if you don't wear a seatbelt, damages are reduced by 30%. "Oh, you're quite right, yes."
And he did have that sort of an accent.
He did.
He
It's
had
a very broad Hampshire.
He did.
His favourite thing in speeches was saying, "Hampshire born, Hampshire bred, strong in the arm and thick in the head."
Well, yeah, I wasn't Hampshire born, so I think I'm okay on that one, but certainly Hampshire bred. And did your father give you advice along the way, along your career journey?
Yes. I lived at home throughout my articles and commuted down to Southampton, and, we were always comparing notes. He was quite interested in what I was doing, and, if I had a particularly interesting case, he would, give a view on it and whatever.
Did you always appreciate his input?
Oh, yeah. No, he was a mentor to me, definitely. Yeah. And, he was a very good lawyer, far better than I ever was. He had a very sensible, he called it middle of the road approach to everything, really. What are the options? Well, probably somewhere down the middle is the right way to go. And that's always resonated with me.
And so when you were doing client work then, so you started off as a trainee solicitor and then you were doing client work.
Yeah.
What sort of a lawyer were you? What discipline were you in? Or were you a generalist?
Funny enough, I came across the letter that the senior partner of Hepburn wrote to me when I qualified, appointing me as an assistant solicitor. And it basically says you're appointed as a assistant solicitor, your salary will be, I can't remember what it was, something outrageous, like £8,000 a year, to undertake general duties.
Right.
So I was, and a lot of lawyers were in those days, generalists. I did some litigation, I did some conveyancing. I didn't really do any probate or anything like that. I was down occasionally in the magistrates' court, bumping into, some of the legal mafia that Southampton had, great characters, lot of work in the county court. But then I did do a reasonable amount of conveyancing, some of it residential, some of it commercial. So it's fairly rounded. I also became quite interested. Our senior partner at the time, Roderick McKean, was a company commercial lawyer, and I became quite interested in company commercial law. And I, got involved in drafting a few commercial agreements. As time progressed, I guess I started focusing more on corporate commercial practice than anything else. I also became a deputy coroner.
Okay.
Roderick McKean was the Southampton coroner for ages. He passed away. His brother, Tom McKean, who was also a partner in the firm, became coroner. And Robert Stone and I sort of assisted him with that work. It was quite a busy sort of, there were coroner's courts every week. And
imagine some fascinating but perhaps sad stories from that time.
It's not a job, I think everybody would want to do. Some of it was quite harrowing. And I mean, actually, some of it made me really quite thoughtful. I mean, you were dealing with unnatural deaths. So, and, some people intended to kill themselves. Other people quite often didn't intend to kill themselves. And it always struck me in those cases, you listen to the facts, and there was family in court listening to the facts, and you just thought, well, that poor person and that family got up that day thinking it was going to be a perfectly ordinary day. And there's a bit of a life lesson there, really, when you think about it.
Yeah.
And so some of those stories were quite harrowing, but it was interesting work. It focused your mind on, life is quite precious, and some people have very difficult lives. Some people, have wonderful lives, but then suddenly the whole thing is turned on its head. It's fascinating, really.
And just reflecting on some of the things you've said so far today, the legal profession's evolved massively, hasn't it, from when you started, even when I started, to where we are today. So we've talked about this generalism, whereas for me on qualification, I was an employment lawyer. Where there wasn't this. I was trained by somebody who did personal injury, employment law, and contract disputes, but then I did employment law, and even now you have people who have specialisms within employment law. It's not, it's of itself got specialisms. We talked also about the growth of the managing partner, and we were just touching earlier on COVID and people sort of working from home. Now you 20 years, I imagine you commuted for the whole 20 years other than that last little piece.
I did.
So do you have a view on working from home and how the profession...
Well, I guess I signed up to commute. When I decided to go to Reading, I signed up to commute, and I knew I had to commute, and it was finding a way of making that work sensibly. There is no easy way to commute. So when we went into lockdown and suddenly I wasn't commuting, I still found myself getting up at the same time in the morning. And actually, I still get up at the same time in the morning, much, perhaps not quite so early. I think I've got two views about working from home. I mean, I think during COVID, we made it work. And I was very impressed, really impressed by how our people adapted so quickly. I mean, literally, we went in a week.
Absolutely.
From being all in the office to all at home because we had to.
Yeah.
The technology coped only just, I have to say, until we were able to bolster it. And that took a month or two, but coped. And people were very, very good about that. But I can remember in those early days having video conferences with junior, solicitors, and they'd be sitting with a sort of trellis table in their bedroom and a cup of tea and files. And you just thought, this is awful. And eventually we were able to get desks out to them and proper facilities. It took a while. But when we were going through that year, there was a gradual realisation this is going to come to an end. But people had got used to it, and some people were really relishing it. Productivity hadn't dropped, and I was really surprised by that. Just the shock of it, you would have thought would knock it for six, but it didn't. So people were playing the game, if you like. But there was something missing. And one of the things I did in the last 3-4 months I was there was to actually do a quite in-depth survey of the staff about their attitudes to coming back to work in the office. Quite a few of the partners were saying, well, we don't need to. And this is great, let's get rid of the premises and, we can just become a virtual law firm and whatever. And I really, really resisted that. And talking to different layers of staff, you got a very different view on it. The really junior lawyers liked the idea of being able to work at home, but felt they were missing something. And what was it? It was the interaction with others, their peers. They quite enjoyed going to work and interacting with their peers on a social level, but also on a professional level. But also they were concerned that they were missing out on the softer training of being part of a law firm, being around other lawyers, talking to other lawyers, listening to conversations between other lawyers, watching other lawyers, practice their arts and craft, and learning by osmosis. And they were really concerned that was going to put them at a disadvantage if they didn't have that. And certainly right down at trainee level, absolutely. How on earth, the trainers were saying to us, how on earth can we do a training contract if we're not around lawyers? So I think it was sort of a sort of inverted sort of concern, really. The people at the top who had experienced were less worried about going back to work.
And I think
offices.
what you described very much reflects my own kind of experience. I think as a partner, when we were fully working from home, I thought this is working really well. We had little workload calls every day, twice a day. We'd meet with the team, make sure we had connections, that sort of thing. And then when we came back to work, because it was a bit in and out, wasn't it, for a while? And we came back and I noticed the number of, can I just have a word? Someone pops their head around the door and says, can I just run this past you, Sarah? And I thought, well, none of that was happening when I was at home. And of course, it wasn't happening when I was at home because people won't phone a partner at home and say, can I just ask you something? Because they don't quite know what they're going to be interrupting. Whereas if you're there in the office, side by side, then they can see, oh, she looks as though she's got a few minutes now, I'll talk to her now. So I very much see the value of side-by-side working. We work on a hybrid basis, a lot of people do. We do 2 days at home, 3 days in the office. It kind of works, but every so often I think, well, perhaps we should be all in.
I think, we have learnt a lot from the experience, and I think hybrid is probably the right way to go about it. But some very interesting things happened. I mean, we obviously throughout the COVID year were still recruiting. Yeah. And suddenly, I was not so close then because I'd stepped down from managing the firm. I was only senior partner, but I suddenly realised we were recruiting people from places around the country that we would never have dreamt of recruiting people because they didn't need to come into the office. And I did sort of say at one sort of virtual partners meeting, well, what are we going to do with these people when actually we do get back to some sort of normality? I mean, they're not going to commute from Cornwall or Nottingham to Reading every day. We made it work, but it was quite interesting. Suddenly, that byproduct of working from home is your horizon can be much greater.
And these are not the things they teach you in law school, are they? These are not the things you've been brought up to know about. Now, I don't know if this is an apocryphal tale,
Okay.
a myth,
what have I done?
a rumour that grew legs, or something that wasn't dismissed. In my training, when I was brought up as a lawyer, I was brought up on tales of Hepburn, Winstanley and Pugh.
Oh dear, right.
And how some lawyer happened to be working on a Saturday morning and these two guys came in and they wanted a lease because they were opening a unit in Swathling. And whilst many lawyers might have said, it's Saturday morning and I'm not going to help, or you look like a couple of start-up people, I don't really think there's much mileage in you as a client, this person took them on. And they took their lease and they were a Mr. Block and a Mr. Quayle and they became B&Q. So I was taught, you must view every client as a potential B&Q because these what startup people might be something amazing in future. Now, how true is that? Was it a Saturday morning advice session?
It was a Saturday morning. It was in 1969. Mr. Block and Mr. Quayle popped into the office because it was open on a Saturday. Not all law firms were open on a Saturday, but Ronald Pugh, who was then the senior partner, ex-mayor of Southampton, met with them. Ronald was a very shrewd businessman, an exceptional lawyer, and they talked about this new idea of basically opening a DIY supermarket. They'd found some premises in Portswood. Mm-hmm. And wanted to get on with it, and Ronald sort of said to them, well, is this going to be the only one? And they said, no, we probably do 2 or 3, so we expect the price to be quite keen. And Ronald was always one for a deal, so yes, that is how B&Q started. David Quayle and Mr. Block came in. Ronald looked after them, and over the next 10 years they opened something like 280 stores. And that's how B&Q grew. We did all that commercial property work for them. I got involved in some of that. They floated on the stock market and Ronald Pugh did the float. They then got acquired by what was then the Woolworths Group, which became Kingfisher. Mm-hmm. And we then continued to act for them under the Woolworths Group as Kingfisher. And
so
they
lesson to
became
every
a
lawyer.
huge client.
Yeah,
Sorry?
absolutely. A lesson to every lawyer there to view every client as a potential Kingfisher Group, I suppose.
Well, and interestingly, a lot of what drove our growth was trying to keep up with B&Q. As that group of businesses, stores grew, a lot of other requirements, employment law. They had quite sophisticated IT systems, point of sale, stock in time. And so they needed people to negotiate contracts with people like IBM. And they had all sorts of regulatory legal issues. They had, problems sometimes when goods were found to be defective, health and safety issues. It was a massive undertaking, really. So we had to grow to keep up with them. If we wanted to retain them as a client, we had to grow to keep up with them. And that was a challenge.
Yeah. And then, of course, they went to Europe, didn't they, to change the Sunday trading laws?
Sunday trading laws, that was quite an incredible period of time. Do you want me to talk a little bit about the history of that?
Yeah, why not?
It was fascinating. The law at the time, this was, I guess, early 80s. The law at the time was the Shops Act 1950. It was an act that had been passed in a hurry as a temporary measure, really, in the 1950s to protect workers in shops from being exploited and being required to work on outrageous hours. It was very badly drafted. It survived over 40 years, even though it was supposed to be a temporary bill. But when we got to the 80s, a lot of people were abusing it. Quite a lot of small shops were open on Sundays selling everything. And what the Shops Act basically said was you cannot sell goods on a Sunday unless they fall within certain exemptions. And that's where it was weak, because the exemptions were bizarre. You could sell a magazine, you could sell motoring accessories, you could sell alcohol and tobacco, food. So, you could buy a bottle of whiskey, but you couldn't buy a Bible on a Sunday. And people were beginning to try and find ways around these restrictions. So, there's this ridiculous story of some shopkeeper opening his shop on a Sunday and saying, right, if you come in and buy a carrot for 35 quid, I'll give you a Black & Decker drill.
Right, okay.
And I'm not breaking the law because all I've done is sold you a carrot. So that was a big weakness in it. The other big weakness was it was enforced by local authorities. The environmental health departments, local authorities were required to enforce it. And it was very patchy in terms of enforcement. Some local authorities just didn't see it really part of their remit to send people out every Sunday to police every store in their borough, and didn't really care about it. Others were far more jealous about it. And some local authorities, the DIY industry decided, well, if they're all opening on Sundays, we'll open on Sundays and we'll see how we get on. Some local authorities were far more keen on catching big stores than little shopkeepers. So the whole thing was brought into disrepute very quickly. People were just breaking the law. And so B&Q decided, well, we need to go about this and get it changed because it's ridiculous. So they just pronounced they were going to open their stores every day on Sundays, and that was it. And they would face the fines if fines came. And so some local authorities prosecuted them. They'd sent their environmental health officers into the stores every Sunday, did a specimen purchase, tin of Dulux paint, and would then prosecute them in the magistrates' court. And very quickly, with 280 stores, every Sunday, there were hundreds of cases going through the magistrates' courts. And we did defend some of them. I was sent down to Torquay once to defend a prosecution. It was a tin of Dulux paint, and we were running the argument that anything that you bought in a B&Q store was a motoring accessory. And the look you gave me was the look I got from the Torquay magistrates. They couldn't quite fathom that out. And I said, well, you can have a caravan or you can have a motorhome, and if you want to decorate it inside, you might use Dulux paint.
Right, you might.
And so when they bought this tin of Dulux paint, how did we know they weren't going to use it in a motorhome? And I think the magistrates retired and took about 3 minutes to convict me. But that's what we expected. We were trying to make a point. Eventually, the local authorities got very fed up with this, and they went off to the High Court and said, look, this is not a civil matter, it's a criminal matter, but they are blatantly breaching the law. Will you give us an injunction? And they persuaded the High Court judge to give them an injunction. We, for B&Q, then appealed that to the Court of Appeal, and eventually to the House of Lords, which was the Supreme Court in those days. It's now called the Supreme Court, but it was a judicial committee of the House of Lords. And the House of Lords very quickly said, no, we can injunct you, you are blatantly breaking the law. And that, could have been the end of it. At the time, though, the whole nonsense of it had been exposed, and there was a lot of lobbying going on to change the Sunday trading laws. And I think there was a committee called the All Committee in 1993, 94, which then recommended that the law should be abolished. And Margaret Thatcher tried to have it abolished and put a bill through Parliament, which was defeated by 14 votes. So we were all then dead in the water. Parliament wasn't going to do anything. The courts were injuncting us. What do we do? And then my partner, Tony Ascombe, who was head of litigation, with a panel of very bright European barristers, came up with this argument of, well, if the English courts won't stop it, why don't we go and see if there's something we can do in Europe? And they created a very interesting argument about whether banning trading on Sunday distorted trading between European countries, between the UK and Europe, and ran it. They pitched up at, I think I was there actually, I pitched up at Cwmbran Magistrates Court, and the magistrates walked in. There was a panel of I think 2 QCs, 3 juniors, and a load of solicitors. And when the charge of trading on Sunday was read, David Vaughan, I think it was, the QC, stood up and pleaded not guilty on behalf of B&Q, and then proceeded to address them for several hours on European law. And magistrates are sensible people, and they quickly came to the conclusion that this was way above their pay grade. So they said, right, well, we're going to remit this to the European Court of Justice and get a ruling on it. So off it went to Europe. That took some time, as it always does. What came back was the most muddled answer you could... I don't think anybody really understood what the European Court had ruled. The local authorities were absolutely convinced that they had won, and B&Q and us were absolutely convinced we had won. So we then went back to all these courts and started arguing again.
Goodness me.
Saying, no, we were saying, no, the Shops Act is contrary to European law and therefore not enforceable. And the local authorities saying, no, that's not what it said at all. So again, the local authorities got pretty fed up with that. I mean, going around every court in the country trying to argue European law is not what the average environmental health department of a local authority should be doing. So they went back to the High Court and got a ruling from, I think it was Lord Hoffman, that there should be an injunction to stop it. We then appealed that directly to the House of Lords again, so up to the House of Lords for the second time. The House of Lords sort of were rather perplexed, I think, by it at this time, saying, we thought we'd sorted this out by going to the European Court of Justice, but clearly we haven't. So we will now remit it to the European Court of Justice and ask a very specific question and get a ruling on this. So off it went back to the European Court of Justice for the second time. The ruling that came back was far clearer and basically was saying, no, it's not contrary to European law. And again, we were dead in the water, really. In the meantime, there was a bit of side litigation going on. We had lots of local authorities trying to take out injunctions, and they were all going for interim injunctions. And you will know this, when you apply for an interim injunction, question of whether a cross undertaking for costs should be given. So the idea being that, if somebody is trying to stop somebody doing something on an interim basis, if eventually it's found that they shouldn't have done that, they have to compensate the party that's been prevented from doing what they may have lawfully been able to do. The local authorities really didn't like that because they just sort of started adding up, well, how much profit are B&Q losing every Sunday if we stop them trading? And they were absolutely up in arms about it. I think the High Court said, no, we will give a cross undertaking. No, the High Court originally said, no, we won't require them to give a cross undertaking. We appealed to the Court of Appeal, who said, yes, you should. So eventually it went back to the House of Lords for the third time.
Okay.
And they pretty quickly said, no, this is ridiculous. This is a local authority undertaking statutory duty to enforce the criminal law. We can't penalise them in this way. So that basically was an end to most of the litigation at that stage. But by that time, the lobbying had got to a stage where Parliament was taking real notice of it. And in 1994, the Sunday trading laws were changed by a bill, and that was it.
So it was 14 people then voted the other way, or had we had a change of government?
Oh, we'd had change of government. I mean, we'd moved on quite considerably by then. And I think, there'd been a lot of interesting discussion around why the social climate had changed to encourage. There were lots of people who were really in favour of Sunday trading. I mean, we did a lot of research for the European cases with economists, and they identified that B&Q could generate 25% of its total income from trading on a Sunday. There was £1 that would only be spent on a Sunday. People would go out as families shopping when during the week they couldn't. There were people who could only work on Sunday. Lots of mothers who were staying at home and bringing up their children, but actually wanted, a work either for money or just for life, could not get out because they had these parental duties at home. but on a Sunday when Dad was not working, they could. So there were all sorts of strange arguments that were threaded together to try and persuade people that it needed change, and it did.
And we talked a lot about change and things that have evolved in your working lifetime, but that's a massive change because it was the country changed as a consequence of the change of law.
30 years ago.
Yeah, and I think back. So I got married in 1993. And I got married to someone who was working in retail, and we got married on a bank holiday because all the shops were shut on the bank holiday, which was ideal. It meant that everybody he worked with could come to the wedding.
Yes.
Well, you couldn't even imagine that happening now. Bank holidays, we're all expecting to be shopping on a bank holiday.
Well, and my daughter for a while worked in retail, and Christmas, she worked for John Lewis, and Christmas was a big time, and Boxing Day, you had to be in working. You didn't have a week off for Christmas if you were in retail. No,
it's really interesting. And I think if you sort of talk to the next generation, the Gen Zs who are coming into the law now, and say, a little law firm in Southampton could be involved in something that actually changes the whole culture of the country.
I wonder if it could happen like that anymore.
Well,
I wonder. I don't know. I mean, B&Q were very loyal to us, and I think it was because we had grown up with them and they'd grown up with us. They were nice people, actually. I mean, I got to know a lot of the senior management at B&Q really well, who were then in place. They were really nice people to deal with. I don't know whether clients are that loyal these days. I think, and I've always said, when it comes to betting the shop on a big case like that, your average company secretary or managing director is going to play safe and go to a big city firm because they won't be criticised for doing that. Going to a small provincial firm to do that sort of work must involve a degree of risk.
But I suppose a lot of it comes down to relationships too, doesn't it? You had all built your relationships. As you say, you grew up with them, they grew up with you. And it's the depth of that. And we talk a lot at Warner Goodman about how we interact with clients and what our relationships are like. And, some aren't loyal, obviously, but others, if you invest in your relationship, will.
I think, in terms of my legal practice, that was one of the joys. I mean, I enjoyed the intellectual, pursuit of law. It is a fascinating sort of area to work in. But actually building the relationships with clients, and over a period of time, making that relationship more than just transactional, spending time with them, perhaps socially, getting to know them really, really well. You become a much better lawyer for it. You are much better able to provide them with, that really good objective advice. Sometimes you have to tell them things they don't want to hear. It's easier to come from somebody they trust.
Yeah, and I always say to my team, employment law, there are no black and whites in employment law. It's all about shades of grey, and you've got to be able to tailor your advice to the ethos, culture, and so on of the client. Yeah. And you can only do that if you get to know the client and relationships, etc. Now, one of the other things that we talked about early on was the merger that Heppards and Bond Pierce. And as employment lawyers, we work alongside corporate lawyers and commercial property lawyers all the time in transactions. And often there's a lot of build-up to a completion. And we're going to have completion on such a... And then the deal completes and we pop the champagne and everybody celebrates.
Usually involves working all night just before.
Yes, round about midnight we start the champagne.
Very macho. Yes.
Yeah. But as employment lawyers, I will often struggle with that because I think, well, that's not actually the end of it at all. Actually, the hard work for both businesses will be post-completion date when you're trying to merge two cultures, two IT systems, rationalise locations, decide whether you've got over. How was it for the Heppards and Bond Pierce? You talked about being director of resources, so that was clearly your role.
It worked really well. I mean, the merger was quite strange, really. The Bond Pierce hadn't been in Southampton very long. They actually took over the office of Boodle Hatfield. And Bond Pierce sent up a chap called Simon Richardson to sort of oversee the Southampton office from their Plymouth office. just so happened that Simon Richardson and I sat next to each other at the College of Law for a year when we did our part ones together. So it was similar vintage, and we knew each other very, very well. And we got chatting. Where we were at the time was, I think we had come to the realisation very quickly that, by the late 90s, we weren't going to grow fast enough to achieve the things that we wanted to achieve. It was just not possible to do that through organic growth. There had to be a step change. So we were quite thoughtful about that. Bond Pierce at the time were in Plymouth, Exeter, and had a small office in Southampton, wanted to open an office in Bristol, but felt they needed a bit more scale to do that. When we started talking to them, there was a huge overlap of interest in disciplines, and culturally very well aligned, I think. So that's how it took off. It's a bit like a marriage. You really don't know until you've tied the knot and you've lived with each other for a bit. And I think it went really, very, very well. Some people loved it. I mean, I've mentioned Tony Askham. I think Tony, was really happy because he was part of a much bigger enterprise with a lot more broader expertise around him to assist him to develop his retail litigation practice and so on and so forth. The property guys seemed quite happy because they had a lot of commonality with the Bond Pierce property guys. So it worked really, really well. I think there was a lot of effort to make it work well, and some of us were charged with moving around the offices quite regularly. I mean, I was on a sort of 2-week rolling pattern, 3 days in Southampton, 2 days in Exeter, 2 days in Plymouth, and perhaps 2 days in Bristol, and then back to Southampton. I mean, I used to wake up in hotels and not know which city I was in. It was ridiculous. And at a time when, poor wife was at home with some young children. It was not easy, but it was really important that some of us did that and were seen to do that. And I think I had one partner, Bob Davis, in Southampton, who would make an annual pilgrimage down to Plymouth because he felt he should. And Bob's arrival in Plymouth was always a bit of an event. He's a bit of a character, and so it was making that effort that made it work, I think. But I think before the merger, we had pretty much recognised that culturally we were aligned. And I, in my Boyce Turner days in Reading, explored merger with a number of firms, and that cultural bit was always the bit that was front of my mind. Will this work culturally? And to make that really, really certain, you had to spend time with people, and as you spent time with people, you got a feel for it. Either it would or it wouldn't.
So it brings us to Boyce Turner then.
Yeah.
And they were exploring the world of having a CEO first time.
Yes.
So what did you bring to Boyce Turner, do you think, and what was the sort of strategic outcome?
I think it's interesting when they first started looking for a CEO. The partners had decided that they wanted to appoint a CEO. I think they got to the point where they said, we need somebody to lead the firm. They hadn't quite thought it through, I don't think, because they also said, and it mustn't be a lawyer.
Right.
Okay. But I didn't know that, and I applied in response to an advertisement in the Times, and I went up for an interview, and they sort of broached this with me and said, well, we were actually thinking perhaps it shouldn't be a lawyer. And I said, well, so, you're an old, classic partnership. Are your partners really going to feel comfortable being led by a non-lawyer? Indeed, are you really going to be comfortable being led by anybody? I mean, that's a $50 million question. And I also said, look, the way lawyers think, I'm a great believer in this. Lawyers approach the world in a particular way. We are trained to approach the world in a particular way. It is, what we have to do. We're very analytical. We are probably quite risk averse. We like to really understand things before we rush to judgment. Is that going to suit a non-lawyer manager? Having those people, and in a partnership, if you're a lawyer partner who's a managing partner, you are what is classically known as the first amongst equals. Mm-hmm. If you're a non-lawyer, probably in those days, because they weren't multidisciplinary partners or LLPs, you wouldn't have been a partner.
No.
You would have been an employed CEO trying to direct the owners of the business.
And wouldn't be considered an equal.
And don't get me wrong, I mean, some people did that role and did it really, really well. But I think, it takes quite an exceptional person and probably quite an exceptional firm to make that a success. Whereas a lawyer going in maybe has a bit more insight into the way lawyers work, the way lawyers think, and the politics of it. There weren't that many of us around who had some flying hours doing law firm management at that stage. So I guess that made me a bit of an attractive proposition. The fact that I'd spent 2 years working in Bond Pierce, a much larger firm, and there's no doubt about it, in those 2 years, I learnt a lot about, how bigger firms are different and how they need to be run. So, I had stuff that I could present to them as I think, persuasive argument that perhaps they should consider me, and they did. But, I can remember 3rd of April, driving up the motorway to Reading. It was my birthday, actually. I started work there on my birthday, and I'm thinking, what am I doing? I was at Bond Pierce last week, and with people I knew, I'm suddenly going to go. And again, it's that you don't really know what you're going into until you get there. But again, really nice people, actually genuinely wanting to develop and change. Huge opportunity in Reading, brilliant market, some really good professional people that you could latch onto in Reading. Challenges, organic growth is hard, particularly in a place like Reading. I mean, I hadn't quite understood how Reading works. Reading is a commuter town in and out. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, was the bane of my life while I was in Reading, you go and recruit trainee solicitors, you train them up, you give them the best training you can, you offer them a very attractive career path. But just up the road is this place called London, where the money is silly, the work is phenomenal, and they can nip on a train and be there in 35 minutes. Mm. So that was a lesson I learned the hard way, really. We lost so much good talent just because the draw of London would take them away, and retaining talent.
And of course, the way that lawyers are trained now has changed as well. Mm-hmm. We're just seeing the last of our trainee solicitors with the LPC, and that route is being phased out. So we're now seeing people doing the SQEs.
Yes.
And also apprenticeship solicitors with a much longer sort of lead-in. And we're using an academy. We've got a WG academy. We take people in, and they're with us for a long period of time in terms of their training and progression. Will that stop the attraction of other firms down the road? I don't know, but it's certainly a different way of doing things than the...
People are very differently motivated. Mm-hmm. I mean, when I became a solicitor and qualified, what did I want? I wanted to build my reputation and career in a location which was Southampton. And my partners at the time, when just after I qualified, were brilliant, taking me out to meet their peers, but they got their peers to bring my equivalent with them. And I met lots of people. I mean, that's how I met Nick. Mm-hmm. But there are probably a dozen other people that I met in that way who became very close friends while I was practicing in Southampton. And, we did a lot of work and business together. I don't think it's like that anymore. You qualify, you tend to specialise immediately. And you don't really do much business development at an early stage. It's something that you're expected to do later in life. probably without any training.
And I think there is a bit of an expectation that the partners will deliver the work and you will do the work, that we'll go and source it and you'll do it. And I certainly, as a trainee solicitor upwards, I mean, I think my very first day with the firm, I was taken out on one of these kind of things. And yeah.
And actually it was wonderful because you actually became part of the community. And I met what I called the legal mafia of Southampton. Philip Ely's senior partner of Paris Smith and Randall, and Malcolm Labar, and Ian Street, who's a great mate of my father's and partner in this firm.
Yeah, he was.
Lots of them. And they were quite important people to know because, I can remember, in the early days going to the magistrates' court, not really knowing what I was doing. And, these characters would be there. And, you do something silly, and one would just come up and say, next time, why didn't you try this, And you just think, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
And that was the legal profession was far more close and
was that before
chummy.
Competition, do you think? Was that, you talked about it as being competitive, a competitive market, were you?
Yeah, I think, right back in those days, there were still a lot of, very close associations between law firms. I mean, I can remember as a trainee, every Friday article clerk, I had to go and do all the completions, in the good old days of
physically
bankers' drafts and march around offices collecting bundles of deeds and whatever. And so if you went to another law firm, you had to go to the bank first and get the banker's draft to take to them, with one exception. Paris Smith and Randall and Hepburn Winstanley Pugh would accept each other's client account cheques.
Ah, there you go.
Because we were mates.
Because you were mates. Now then, you're fully retired now, and I know you've got your world of the dog and your walks in the forest and that sort of thing. Do you miss the world of law?
Do I miss the world of law? That's a very good question. I planned retirement. I was very, very clear. I mean, there's a bit of a sort of backstory to this. My father was a judge. He didn't have to retire until he was 75. 68, diagnosed with cancer, passed away. Never really retired. He had to stop work for a while, but he never really retired. Did he regret that? I don't think so. He loved his job and he was very, very good at it. But I just sort of took stock of that and said, and I guess it was also part of my coroner's experience, at some point you have to work out what you want in life, and I decided I wasn't going to work until I died. So I sort of planned that I would retire when I was ready. I'd done 20 years as a CEO in a law firm in Reading, commuting. Some of it was exhilarating. Some of it was really quite stressful. And I don't think you realise until you stop doing something how consuming it is, actually, and how stressful it had been. But I sort of got to 20 years and I thought, actually, I'm ready. Mm-hmm. I also thought it would be good for the firm. 20 years, I mean, actually, it's too long. You shouldn't be a CEO of a law firm, the same law firm for 20 years. You shouldn't. And so I said I was going to retire in 2 years' time. Let's plan it. So I was ready. And I knew that there were certain things I wanted to do. I mean, the dog was one of them, but, do some travelling with my wife. You make endless lists of things you're going to do at home. You do them all in the first 3 months. Mm-hmm. You just get through it. But also spending time with friends and family. And we've got grandchildren now, so we're able... My job this afternoon is to go and look after our granddaughter. Right. So that's great joy. But also just enjoying not doing things. And somebody once said to me, when you retire, never feel guilty about not doing anything, because live in that moment. So when you get up in the morning, if you want to sit down and read the paper for an hour, read the paper for an hour, because that's what retirement's about. If you want to go for a walk with the dog, don't feel it has to be just half an hour and get back and do something. Go out for an hour and a half, 2 hours. It doesn't matter. What was the other one he said? Yeah, look out of the window, and if the grass needs cutting, don't worry if you decide to do it tomorrow.
Well, you've sold it to me, Andrew. I'm definitely up for the retirement thing, but I think maybe a few more years to go. But
Well, you've got to be.
does sound appealing.
I mean, there's some people who never retire because they love what they do so much. I'm not one of those people who lived to work. I very much worked to live, and I remember 6 months after retirement, an old friend rang me and just said, "How are you getting on?" And I said, "Fine." He said, "Oh, so you're coping with retirement?" I said, "Well, what is there to cope with?" And he said, "Well, I rather thought, your role and your work defined you." And I said, "Look, we've known each other for 25 years. You really didn't know me
Very well at all, no.
It didn't.
It doesn't.
No.
We normally end with, your top tips and words of wisdom, but I think your words of wisdom about retirement will ring in everyone's ears. So I think we'll move instead to the audience-sourced question, which is the very final piece of the podcast, and your question is in this envelope.
Oh dear, right, okay. Audience sourced. Oh, well, I bet I know where this has come from. What is it? If you could have any superpower in the world, what would it be and why? Oh, crumbs. I mean, superficially, I wish I could read my dog's mind.
Ah, yes.
I look at that animal sometimes and it's sitting there looking at me and I just, what are you thinking?
Yeah.
But that's a bit sort of, I think, I don't know. I mean, I've always tried to relate to people by getting to understand, what drives them. One of my favourite things to do is when we go on holiday, and you're in a hotel in Thailand or something. Go and get to know the bar manager in the pool bar. For two reasons. First of all, you'll get excellent service if you make the effort to get to know them. But they're interesting people, and it took me a long time to be brave enough to just go and chat to complete strangers in that sort of situation. But it's fascinating. I don't know whether that's a superpower, but if I could keep developing that would be quite nice, actually. Get the ability to just talk to strangers. I've been very lucky. I've travelled, I think I counted up 42, 45 countries. And the one thing that strikes me is, all these countries are different. They all have slightly different reputations. They all have their problems and their issues and their politics and whatever. When you go and meet the ordinary people in a country and you talk to them, we're all exactly the same. Yeah. We all have problems. We all have issues. Actually, we all want to relate to each other. We're all quite interesting. And I do find people interesting. And I guess if I can develop a power, I don't know, to spend more time doing that and getting to know people, strangers, I think it's fascinating. People watching.
And in the meantime, you'll work on the dog language on your forest walks, no doubt.
Yeah, that's going to frustrate me for the rest of my life, I think. I don't know what it's thinking.
Thank you so much for your time today, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.
Been an honour.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. I hope you found it insightful and empowering. To stay connected, why not hit the subscribe button? Or if you think your friends might be interested, why not rate us as a 5? To be first to know about upcoming episodes, follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram and LinkedIn, where you'll find us at Warner Goodman LLP, or follow us on YouTube, where our episodes are at Piece of Pod. Thank you again. Until next time.